Welcome to Next Economy Now. I'm Kevin Bayuk, a partner and worker owner at Lyft Economy. Lyft is an impact consulting firm whose mission is to create, model, and share a locally self-reliant economy that works for the benefit of all life. The goal of this podcast is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, democratic, transparent, and whole systems approach to using business as a force for good. My guest today is Carol Sanford. Carol is a much celebrated author and speaker, sharing examples that inspire and instruct businesses to reimagine their way of working and change industries, social systems, cultural beliefs, and governing practices. Her highly praised books, The Responsible Business and her latest, The Responsible Entrepreneur, among others, are required reading at leading business schools including Harvard, Stanford, Haas Berkeley, and MIT. Carol has worked with and works with all the functions and levels of businesses, from C-suite executives of finance, business development, sales, marketing, IT, R&D, to day-to-day operations leadership. In this interview, I learned from Carol about some of the current focus of her work on a core education and development process for leaders in business that fundamentally informs the actions that they can take from a regenerative perspective. Carol is extremely erudite in sharing her observations and very precise in her diction. Her decades of work and writing have revealed a significant gap in kind of the mindset of business leaders. Using mnemonics that reminded me of the style of adages of ancient wisdom traditions from around the world, Carol walked me through the way she approaches educating the mind to transform the way one sees life and the way to evolve personal and organizational capacity to discover and become a greater expression of one's essence in a way that contributes to one's role as it is nested in a living system. One core insight I took away from this podcast is the importance of acknowledging that simply having a list of best practices or a checklist of actions is not adequate to actually move us to a regenerative paradigm. Changing mindset first is critical to enable us to have the greatest leverage or nodal impact. We also touch on the distinction Carol makes between empathy and caring, how Carol shares her work in the world with curated groups, events, media, and with individual clients ranging from Shell to Google Innovation Labs. Carol shares some of her personal story that brought her to expressing her essence in the world and shares some fun foreshadowing about her new forthcoming book. Without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Carol Sanford. Welcome, Carol, to Next Economy Now. We're so grateful to have you.
Well, I'm excited to be here. Looking forward to your questions.
Wonderful. I guess the first question I have is Lyft Economy has a vision for an economy that works for the benefit of all life. We see that the current economy right now, by its kind of DNA and its nature, creates terrible outcomes for people and planet. I'm curious about your thoughts. Is it possible for the economy to work for the benefit of all life? And what's missing now? What are the big things that are on your mind when you think about that?
Well, I think anything that works with the way life works can make it work for all of life. The problem is, what's missing is we don't actually understand how life works. We have created a way of viewing the world that is very fragmented, where we see, you were careful to say that it works for all life, not works for all. So we've usually fragmented humans away from other living entities as though humans were not nested in and embedded in. And then we separate economy out from all sorts of other things that are not seen as integrated and nested. And the more we fragment, the more we are not working like life. So to me, there is a core education and development process that's missing before we can do any of the things. Like I could suggest do this and do that. And the problem is it would probably be out of a fragmented, I see a problem here, I see something there, somebody else sees something. But what we do is get cause-related or issue-related solutions. So my work is driven toward the idea that until we educate the mind, that can see life and see how life works, we can't do anything. So all of these various groups, B Corp, B Lab, SOCAP, Sustainable Brands, various businesses, all of them are working with a part of something, and none of them, even us with well and good intentions, right? I mean, we talk about the conventional people and how they don't see things. The problem is because we are reactive to how bad things were, we're creating some other things which don't get us there. Can I give you another step on that?
Sure, please.
Okay. I've been working for the last year or so trying to give what I would call focused, concentrated ways of seeing what the three different paradigms or worldviews are that we're working from, and educating people about how to do that. And I can tell you a little bit about how we're educating so people could join, play if they wanted. But I see really these three worldviews at work. Well, there's really four, but four is the one that we know is terribly problematic, as the way you described it. The base one, which is not what I'm advocating we start working on, is what I'd call extract value. So, I bought it, I've tended it, I've put money into it, I have produced things out of it, I can sell it whenever I want, and I get to take out of it what it is I deserve. So that's the extract value worldview, which just drives us all, running our fingernails on a board. It's so frightening. But there are three other worldviews which held independently don't get us there. So if you think of the kind of the next level up from extract value, most of us went crazy somewhere in the 1970s and 80s. I'm that old and been working on it that long, when we could see this extract value taking us down a very big path. And we formed something that might be called a rest disorder paradigm. Do less bad, stop the harm, quit doing this, quit doing that. And that has a pretty high level intention, because it was to try and slow down, and knew that if we didn't stop wasting Earth's resources, extracting faster than she could rebuild them, that there wouldn't be anything left for us. The problem with that was that it is, and maybe Zeno's paradox, where you get halfway there and halfway there and halfway there, and it never gets you there because halfway is never there. And the idea of trying to arrest disorder is a very incomplete way to pursue something. Now, doesn't mean that we should not do that, but it was just incomplete. I started writing about that about 20 years ago, as I saw the term sustainability become really popular, maybe it was 30 years ago, and said, well, sustainability is trying to get something back to something. Wonder what that is. Problem solving is trying to get it back to something. And I finally realized that what it's doing is related to another worldview, which is that ideals exist. Like we say, waterways should be handled in a certain way. Cultural folks of indigenous culture ought to be thought about in a certain way. Teenagers being raised ought to be thought in a certain way. And we can't see that we all do that. We can only see it when the guys we don't agree with our ideals do it. So there are maybe some religious paradigm that has an ideal about what humans are supposed to do in relationship to some greater being. And out of that comes a whole set of ideals. But it's not only religion that does that, it's government and political parties. So the Democrats, and long ago, the Whigs and the Republicans and the Libertarians and Green parties, all of those create ideals. The minute you've got these ideals, then what you always have is something sliding away from that. That's where we got to arrest disorder, because it's disorder from some ideal. And that was how we could see the extract value as a problem. So the funny thing is, when I started writing, I was working with seventh generation 10 years ago for about the 5 years after that. And one of the things I said to Jeffrey and to the leadership team was, this doing less harm is never going to accomplish what the wonderful intentions of this organization are about. So Jeffrey pretty quickly started talking about, well, we have to not only do less bad, we have to do good. So the do good movement came about. And the do good movement tried to proscribe, maybe they didn't even start with prescription. They started with, not only should we be less bad, but we should do something good. So philanthropy became a really strong thing that businesses were doing, plus community giving back, working with boards, all those kind of things were about doing good. And so that's quite a big step beyond doing less bad. The challenge is that it comes off of these ideals. The people who were trying to do good, like B Corp, B Lab, like Living Future, like many other organizations, decided they would create a certification process for these ideals. So you get B Lab, which in order to become, you have to be certified. You have to go through this process of being assessed, being looked at, and then someone else decides that you meet the criteria. The problem is and I'm not beating up B Lab. I love them. I write about them in my books. I think that they're really trying to change how we think about what it means to be in business. But they're part of the problem in the way that every other group is. Building a challenge is a part of what Living Future does. All of those are fragmented in terms of that they pick some pieces. And part of it comes from trying to be able to figure out a financial way. So we're back to economy, right? This is why, to me, this is a big deal, because I think it's undermining a healthy, vital economy where the do-good people are creating more of the splintering and the setting of ideals which meet their criteria, but they don't necessarily work the way life works, because life doesn't work with working on a watershed or working on a river. It works on a life process that is bounded by some boundaries, but it's much more interactive. So that's the second. So we have the very first paradigm or worldview, which is extract value. None of us want that one, except for when we get paid. We need to get a reciprocal kind of thing. The second one was arrest disorder, which we've driven almost into the ground for about 40 years. In the last 10 years, the B Corps of the world and others, and even some great businesses, have moved to the do good. But what I'm trying to help get people to see is that none of those actually meet your definition of what your program is about, which is how do you make it good for all of life? And that's because none of those actually start from the idea of how does life work. What they do is start from an ideal either behavior or outcome, and then they set up judgment criteria, which then distract people from how the whole works and work only on those set of things. So the thing I've been working on for 40 years, and I'm, getting pretty old and deep in it, as you said, you find a lot of paths leading back to me. I've written a lot, spoken a lot, but it's using the idea of regeneration. So I call the fourth paradigm regeneration, but in the same way that it has two terms, like extract value, arrest disorder, do good. It's about evolving capacity. We don't spend much time thinking about how evolve capacity. We assess whether it meets the criteria or not, whether it's off the mark of where they're supposed to be or not. So my energy and my work goes into helping people understand what it means to evolve capacity in the way that life works. And I've done several talks in the last couple of years over describing 4 new approaches that people are doing to try and use what they call living systems. And we think the minute they've said living systems, it must be how life works. Nope, actually it turns out that they're partial, because the worldview leads us to things still using machine view. So I won't go through all of these unless you decide you want to, but the idea of working on regeneration, I've now developed 7 principles, because I don't believe if you do practices or ideals, you can get out of the ditch that we're in. I believe you have to understand what the premises, what the foundation is, the principle of how life works. And the core ideal is that you have to evolve the capacity of every life form, and that can be human beings, it can be animals in the wild, it can be whole water, I call them life sheds, not watersheds, because we call them watersheds because they give us water, right? So it's anthropocentric view. So if you come to understand how something in life works, you now have an ability to evolve its capacity to do that better. Not to treat it less bad, not to do some good things for it, like go clean up the rivers and restore them, but instead to actually work with it in a way that it involves the capacity of that living system to live more. And this is another key to regeneration. They aren't all the same. Every life shed is different. Every human being, you and I are completely different people, although I suspect we share some similar ideals. We look very differently, but more importantly, how we engage in the world is different. So I say it's going to evolve capacity of an entity, a living entity, to become more of its own essence, its uniqueness, its distinctiveness. Because, well, let me tell you the story I often tell so you can see why this second piece about essence is important. Do you have children, Kevin?
I have one daughter.
Okay, well, soon you will probably have more, but even that one daughter, you could work with a do less bad with your daughter. You should miss fewer of whatever she's doing, right? You should be home more often. You should be avoiding yelling at her. So all those are less bad kind of things, right? Or you can decide to do good. You could play with her in ways that are really creative and innovative. You can read books on good parenting, and you can take on many of the kind of generic ideas about good parenting. But unless you pay attention to her, what's her name?
Her name is Sophia.
So if you don't look at Sophia as an individual, singular, essential being, and you say, how do I help evolve the capacity of Sophia? Not a child at this age, but Sophia and what she's trying to be in the world. How do I step into her world? How do I understand her? You really can't get to the regenerative paradigm. You can't get there from standardization, from best practices, from anything that's the same, because you can't evolve capacity generically. That's called training. We all look the same. Evolving capacity in the regenerative paradigm is the ability to see Sophia and each other unique child, each other unique being in our partnering relationships, in our not just parenting or partnering, but in our leadership roles. How do we see each person who works in the organization as a unique being, having an essence which is seeking to be discovered and expressed? So that we have the evolved capacity of each living entity to be able to discover and express its own essence and its uniqueness into the world in a way that, so now we're moving in a way that it contributes to a role that is a part of a nested system. Not it gets its own thing, not its own ego gets brought up, but it is seeing itself as nested in a living system, and it's able to contribute in a way that it realizes more its potential. Mm-hmm. So now one of the things that's very exciting is none of us are as good as we're going to be. None of us have expressed and discovered as much as we can. So to me, regeneration is evolving this capacity of each unique individual to discover and refine its essence and expression such that it can realize over time more and more of its potential as a contribution, as making a difference in a role that is nested in these living systems. Mm-hmm. There's only one last thing that makes it regeneration. That's a lot, right? I said there's seven.
Yeah.
Quick overview. So we'll take Sophia, and we want to evolve her capacity as a living, unique being, and I could say the same thing for any business, in a way that we can discover her essence and help her express that, so that more of her unique potential can be contributed in roles that she takes on to make the difference. And the last thing, which is really hard to do because it requires a really different mind, is to do it in a way that's what I call nodal. It is, you do this. It's like an acupuncture needle. You put this intervention in place or this needle in place, and the whole system moves. And it moves in a way that's significant, not leveraging so you get a lot and you get a lot back, but instead you leverage a whole system getting healthier. So you started with asking me, do I believe that things can get better and that we're moving there, and what's missing? Well, what's missing is the understanding to me of those 7 items that I was talking to you about, the ability to think nodally when we intervene in understanding a nested system, to allow each unique being to contribute, and we're evolving their capacity to do that over time. So there's a very long answer, but to me that's the level of what's missing. That's the mind that is missing. So we end up with all these ideals, these generic practices, best practices, dogma, all the stuff that goes with it that doesn't change except in content when you go from group to group. That is what needs to evolve.
Great. So what I got from that, a number of things, which I really appreciate that answer. It's depth, it's clarity. You've invested in articulating this in a way that can communicate. So practicing even that mindset that you're sharing about, practicing empathy in the way that you've articulated that.
Beyond that, wait a minute, I got to stop you.
Tell me.
You got to move from kindness past empathy, past compassion, into caring.
Into caring.
Because you can't get to caring, really deeply caring. So let me tell you what the difference in those 3 or 4 are.
Sure.
And then you can keep going, because I have invested a lot in this. Kindness is when we see we are just kind of what we do because we're a good person. Empathy is when I can feel your pain, right? Or I can feel what you're feeling. Compassion is when I not only can feel it, but I want to help you get rid of it. I'm going to give you money. I'm going to get you off the street. I'm going to put you through college. But caring is the evolving capacity piece. I care enough that you become able to express who you are, that I'm going to invest myself in growing who you are. So keep going. But what I'm working on is caring, and then it'll include compassion and empathy, and we better all be kind. So remember where you were going?
I think I do. This idea that the mindset is one of the limiting factors. All the other things are maybe even superficial or secondary, at least ancillary, if we're working from an incomplete mindset. And so I'm assuming, and I want to hear about some of the work you're doing to share that mindset. One thing that came up with this continuum from kindness to caring, I'm going to ask you a question that's come up for me. I have my own answer for myself, but I'm curious if you would be willing to share for others, for the benefit of others, if somebody has a rather cynical disposition at a moment in time and they say, why should I care? If somebody asks that question, I'm kind of curious what you might say about why should anybody care?
Well, I don't advocate and try and tell people how to think. What I do is educate people. And I only work with people who have will to do that. So if somebody says, as a kind of devil's advocate kind of thing, I'd probably say, well, probably you shouldn't. I'd probably leave them alone. I am not interested in broadcasting in a way that people adopt what I think. I'm very interested in people having will to come join something and grow themselves, because I believe you have to test everything I say before you accept it or reject it. In both ways, you should test it. But caring is something that comes from being developed, not from being convinced. I mean, we know right now that the mind that doesn't believe in climate change or believe humans contribute to it or even can do anything about it, I think, comes from a belief system. So if they said, why should I care about climate change? And I'm trying to convince them, I'm arguing against something that's held in the mind. So we're back to mindset, right? And I filter all answers through what I already believe. So I would say, don't respond to that question. Just say, I'm not sure why. Tell me why it is you don't think you care. I'd start doing questions. And I probably would put in a lot of things that I thought they couldn't answer, but not to make them wrong, but to get their will up, to get their interest up, to engage, because that's, to me, all that matters is you want to engage, you want to grow yourself, you want to reflect. So that's how I go about it. I don't advocate, I educate. And it's educating the mind, not educating on content of what you should think.
Wonderful, very clear. Maybe I could ask the same question then in a way that might educate us through example, would be, why do you care? Because it's self-evident that you do, through the work you do, the dedication, the perseverance of the number of years of exploring and educating and shaping, changing mindsets, being a conduit of transformation for the large parts of the economy, for building this new possibility. Amazing work. So why for you personally?
Well, this is going to be a little bit strange, but I believe that I finally found my essence work. I found what I have been curious about since I was a child, let's talk about 4 years old, was why people thought the way they did. And I had an opportunity to see that in stark contrast, because my father was a Ku Klux Klan leader, a grand wizard, I think they called him. And he had lots of Hispanic, they called them wetbacks because they swam across the Rio Grande to get work, right, to get their life. And these people, I knew their children. They were amazing to me because you play with other people's kids. You don't know what color their skin is. And I could never understand why my father saw them so differently than I did. And I used to, even at the age of 4, I had the same Spitfire way of going after things when I was 4. And I would say to him, Javier is a good friend. Why do you say that about his father? And he was able to, because he had some pretty important political roles, he was able to cause a lot of harm. And as I grew up, I got in more and more trouble. I got locked in closets to try and shut me up, and none of it ever worked. So one of the reasons that I am so committed is that I had people who tried to stop me from something I could see a long time ago that needed to be confronted. And then I went through a very strong part of being a part of a very conservative, extremely radical religion because of how I was brought up. And I tried very hard to completely dedicate myself to it. And I began to question, which I think we should question everything, and found that I got in a lot of trouble in the church I was in, partly because I was a woman and I wasn't allowed to question, but just nobody was really allowed to question. And of course, it just riled me up even more. And so eventually I left that path and started looking for ways. And I found the kind of schools and communities that I began to do this reflective work. I was a professor for a little while, so this grew in me. And everywhere I went, what I could see were people held on to myths about how things worked and what was true, and there was no process for confronting it. It's not like I wanted to confront the myth directly. I wanted to be able to confront how we got to the myth and why it never got challenged. So I began to read, and I'm very much probably my scholarly work has been more in philosophy, ancient wisdom traditions, but as well as psychology, including Western Socratic processes, all the Greeks. I have spent hours and hours reading that. I spent a lot of time looking at brain research long before it was popular. It was called cognitive psychology when I was studying it and working on a doctorate. Those things all educated me about seeing why this problem of how we are developed to think and see. And I ended up writing a dissertation that was based on the idea that the way we do research causes us problems. That research itself is to prove a truth, therefore an ideal. And what was going on in the mind of the researcher, and I could see it in myself, was an unreflective process. I had a premises, my premise was to be proved. I was to work through, all of the scientific method to get to there. And I could see my own mind reframing and getting so that I could get this doctorate written and approved. And so I changed what I was doing and said, I think there needs to be a different method. So I created a theoretical dissertation, which was about how it is that you have the scientists learn to examine themselves while they examine their subject, and how that process itself would give us better understanding, which might be more important than answers, which we knew, and I could see this even then. The answers will soon be disproved because somebody else sees a piece, a fragment, because you're required in order to do this scientific method to narrow it down to such a small part that we're back to not seeing how something works. So I think my caring was framed by all of that. But then as I began to understand my own unique essence, which was playing out in all of those, I began to understand I had a role in the world, and my role was to educate people like you, the people like Zach, the people who were in the world trying to figure out how to do it, that if they weren't able to work from a more systemic understanding, which included themselves, seeing their own methods and their own inability to reflect and reject and accept based on having tested something, that we could never get a world that was healthy. And so I kind of saw my work as a meta level of building the capacity, evolving the capacity to do this work. So I don't know if that gives you an answer to a question, but it gives you a bit of my story about how I kind of got there.
I appreciate your story, and I'm really grateful for, again, it's a courageous path as the way I see it. You're pioneering and integrating a lot of bodies of work and thought, and moving into that meta level and that process level that not a lot of people tread in. So I'm grateful that you're there.
Thank you.
I'm curious to hear about some of the work you're doing, so that if people want to play and learn more about what you're doing, I want to know about those things. I'm also kind of curious with some of the education you do and some of the mindset transformation and process that you've shared with others. What are some of the things that you're seeing manifest in the world that are exciting to you? Businesses or organizations or things that inspire you, or at least that you're excited about? That would be very interesting to me.
Yeah, I actually don't believe much in inspiration. Socrates died because he figured this out. So I'll tell you that piece first, and I'll tell you actually how I apply it and what I see. So Socrates watched the sophists, they were called, who went out and stood on soapboxes and tried to inspire people to be able to make something great happen in themselves, go out, be better people. Here are all the core values you could live by. And Socrates decided he wanted to be a sophist. So he practiced that. But as he watched, he noticed these people who went off inspired came back discouraged. And they would go listen to the same sophist over and over again. Please re-inspire me, lift me up again. I'm feeling hopeless. And as he watched, he realized that what was happening is the sophists were trying to put something into people rather than help people find it and growing up themselves. So that's why Socrates developed a method, which isn't just questions, but a lot of it was to ask questions, not because Socrates had the answer or even thought they did, but to develop their courage to look for answers that they didn't have. Therefore, Socratic method, the state saw that as very, very dangerous. What? You're going to have people think for themselves? You're going to have people test what the government tells them, what not in their case, but in others' church tells us. And we know that many churches killed out groups which were thinking for themselves. That process is very, very dangerous. So Socrates was killed for it. So I remind myself of that often, that I do walk a dangerous, but I can't do anything else. I mean, it is who I am. So how am I bringing this into the world? I have kind of three levels that I work at. They're like the esoteric, the mesoteric, and the exoteric. Those are Greek terms. The esoteric means at the heart of something. So I work with a very few people who are interested in all this multidisciplinary exploration of reading everything from Socrates or the Mahayana Buddhist text, or I'm part Native American. I am a small amount Mohawk, but I was actually immersed in that tradition as a young child by my grandfather, who was very, very connected to the lineage from his great-great-great. So finding these different lineages, I have people that if they're showing real interest, that can become immersed in that level of work. The middle level of work is with other people who are change agents, who are and that's, where folks who've found my work and said, I want to not do what you do, but I want to learn by how you learned and by the process and become actively engaged. And it is a community of folks which meet regularly 4 times a year in 4 locations, in the U.S. and then outside the U.S. And plus there's webinars and stuff in between. And there are, between those in Northern Europe and those in the U.S. and those in Mexico, there are about 200 people who regularly are being I guess you'd say, educated and developed to be able to see their own mind, and then to be able to go do that with other people. That's a lot of fun, because these are people who are really also, what you're calling courageous, but they're rigorous. They're willing to be really precise. I mean, one of the reasons I can communicate very clearly is I've become very precise about what I mean by things. And I ask other people to do the same thing. So when you say empathy, I say, let's talk about that. When somebody says watershed, I say, let's talk about that. Because to me, those are conversations rather than you ought to do something different. The level which most people touch my work is the exoteric, which is that which touches the world. And I have several different ways I do that. I do a lot of podcasts myself, interviewing people who are seeking to make a difference in the world. And I have 2 channels in iTunes, one called the Regenerative Business and one called the Responsible Capitalist. So I'm interviewing people who I think are seeking to bring about change in an active way in the world in economics and processes about how money works. And then others who are business owners, or in a couple of cases, a not-for-profit that I believe is operating in a way that can make a real difference, because most not-for-profits can't. They're just operating with very incomplete ideas about how living systems work. So podcast, I do a lot of blogging and guest blogging. I guest blog. You can go look me up in Stanford Innovation Review, The Guardian, I can't even think of where else. Sustainable Brands. There are a lot of folks. CNBC. I've done my own blogs, which I do fairly regularly. I sometimes will then go for a couple of months without doing them, but you'll find hundreds of blogs I've written. I write books, and so you can find The Responsible Business or The Responsible Entrepreneur, which if I had any say over, they wouldn't have had those titles, but I lost the battle to Wiley because they wanted me to put sustainability in, and I said, I can't do that. I'm in this book saying don't talk about sustainability. So anyway, I finally got at least responsible. I have a new book that will be out this year that is about the regenerative business and organization. So how it is you design work. And I've seen a lot of popular new ideas about designing work that are getting rid of supervisors. I did that in my early work. I thought hierarchies are a problem. So I got rid of them. And then I discovered that it actually didn't work very well for the business, and you could do something really different. I did a lot of new startups where we just started without supervisors and said, when we need them, we'll put them in, and we never did. It's like you could design work, but you have to design it so people are tied directly to the business, not just to their work that replaced the supervisor. So this book is about really the 3 criteria you have to know whether human potential is really being developed, and the 3 conditions that the organization has to create in order for it to work. So you can't just do one thing, like remove supervisors. So that book will be really fun. Plus, it talks about why the way we're building and designing work is undermining our democracy. And if we want democracy to work, and boy, we've got to do some work on that soon. And that's not a partisan comment. It's like everybody's feeling like government doesn't work anymore. And it's because we're building human beings to be these rigid, compartmentalized, dichotomized in how we do work. So I do the writing of those books. That book will be out. And then there'll be another book next year called The Regenerative Paradigm, which will take those 7 criteria or first principles I talked about. I do a lot of education, executive education. I have programs. I've had one at UW-Bothell. That one is closing, but it's going to spin out into 2 other forms. One is in a partnership with Babson College in Wellesley, the Boston area. Another one is through private endeavors. We're starting one in Seattle in June and one in Europe shortly after that, Northern Europe, probably Amsterdam, which will take businesses who come together in the same way my change agent group does, and they learn over a year. And then many of those groups, when I've done them before, we end up going 2 or 3 years, because you can't really make all the changes in the mind in, you don't do it in 3 months, much less a year, but you can get a good start in 3 years. So I've got those, Babson, and then my own individual ones. I also have individual clients where I take the change agents in with me so that we're working on it live. I mean, over the years, I mentioned 7th generation. I worked with Chad Holliday, who is the one who co-founded the UN Global Compact, and he's in DuPont. And then he's now the CEO of Shell, and he's the one who stopped the drilling in the Arctic as chairman. He's a pretty amazing human being. And the way we worked there was we did education processes with leaders and that were cross-functional up and down the organization. But it was really a rethinking about how you do strategy so that it's more systemic, more responsible, and it's embedded in it, not a separate program, how you change how leadership works, and then how you redesign work. So I would work with someone like Chad in each organizational unit from 3 to 8 years. So I started working with him when he was 28 years old. And then he went all the way up, became chairman, CEO, and president of DuPont. And the book, The Responsible Business, gives quite a bit of what he was doing, what he did for 8 years, not as much as he would have loved. And then it was time for him to retire, and so he went off. But there were major changes happened in the mining industry as a result of his consciousness in the climate change. He was on Obama's energy commissions. And so I believe that if I can build that mind, these folks will grow. They will go to the top of the organization. I don't always have to have the top when I start, but I have had a lot of those. And so we do that as an education process and changes the structure, systems, and processes of the business. I'm now engaged in participating very actively in a couple of innovation labs at Google. And the Food Innovation Lab is bringing together 100 folks from around the world. We're led by a guy named Mikkel Bakker, who came out of Amsterdam, but he is now the global food services food manager, which means much more than feeding people. It means actually Google playing a role in changing how the world thinks about food. And that's Mikkel's work. He wants to change our relationship to food on the planet. And if you remember, Google's mission is really about finding what really works and making it available to everybody in the world so that we democratize understanding rather than power plays with it. So he has brought together these folks from universities, from farming, from big ag down to organic farming, and they have created a CSA, a commercial CSA with the farmers along the coast of California, so they pre-buy their produce, and he wants to learn how to scale organic. So those kind of processes, and they use my work. They buy hundreds of copies of my books and distribute them not only inside of Google, but to their suppliers and to their customers. And I get to speak there a lot and bring as much as I can to what I think is magnificent about what they're doing. There's some things going on that people don't know about. I tried to write more about what Larry Page's intention is in my book, The Responsible Entrepreneur, where he actually sought to affect how the SEC and the FCC work by how he does business, because he knew going to government trying to lobby wouldn't do it. And so those are results of building the mind that can do this kind of work. And I'm now working with a Lowe's wholly owned subsidiary, Orchard Supply Hardware, which is a 50-year-old almost company that has an incredible essence. And we go back and we find that essence. We find those stories and how it is that made them great and how they grew and why they've still survived in the face of the big box stores. And so doing that kind of work, and it's an education process again over a series of years. We're in our first year now with the Orchard Supply folks, or Orchard as they call them. We've got some work going with T-Mobile to do that. So and then I have many smaller businesses. Like when I started with Seventh Generation, they had 25 people and only a few $1 million in sales. And yet they didn't have the platform to do what Jeffrey needed to do. So we actually grew them about 30, well, it's more than that. I think Jeffrey in Harvard Business Reviews named the work I was doing as having grown them 45 to 65% in revenue a year. And they did that completely responsibly because I teach them there are different ways to think about growth. And when people think about it as expansion, extracting more resources, we don't want that. But there are other ways to grow. And so what we did is took them so that they were highly profitable. Jeffrey had a platform and a voice such that Walmart asked for his help. Took a little bit of it, not all of it. But now, Seventh Generation has been purchased by Unilever, and Jeffrey is back on their board of directors. So, of the Seventh Generation part. So those are some of the things I do. There's one other exoteric thing that I do, which is create public events. And this is newer for me. I'll tell you, it's been a steep learning curve. I don't do conferences. I do summits, because conferences have a bunch of talking heads where the experts are on the stage and you and I sitting in the audience know nothing. That's dumb. I create summits that are invitation only. We've found that they're very exciting because what they are is there's no opportunity to hear from an expert. I set up the process, but these invitation-only business owners or heads of a business unit, most of them actually own their businesses, and they're everything from fairly small ones. They have to be in business 3 years to get invited. They work as thinking partners with us, giving them different frameworks to think about. And we create fish bowls where I interview a business on the stage and show people how to do this kind of work with the 7 first principles, and watch their eyes light up and watch the audience go, I can see it now, so it becomes alive. So again, that's an education process. With all those people did podcasts and so forth so you can connect with them. I'm now partnering with Babson College to do one on the East Coast. And, who knows, eventually we might do one in Europe. I'm 74 years old, so who knows how long I can keep expanding these. But those are the kind of work I do and where they show up. And some of those things might interest people that would want to join. And they can send me an email. Can I just give them an email? It's easy. Carol@carolsanford.com. So Carol Sanford is CarolSanford.com. As I say, it's all about me, so you can remember the email. So you can let me know, and we do have websites, which we can come back to give people a little more too, whenever that's appropriate.
Yeah, definitely. Before we finish, I'll ask for those websites, and I'll definitely link to them in the podcast. That was great. That was a good summary of the work that you're doing in the world and some examples of projects that, if not inspire, at least excite you or that you're excited about.
They give me hope.
Yeah, they give you hope.
Hope producing, right?
Hope producing is a really good thing. Are there other resources that you might think that might be a good fit for people who are listening to this podcast, excited about the next economy, maybe friends, allies, or students of yours that you think that listeners might want to know about?
Regenesis Group is one that I often recommend. And Regenesis Group is doing stuff at the level of local and with specific communities that want to take on these ideas. The 7 first principles come out of co-work that my dearest friend, who is one of the founders with her husband of Regenesis Group, and they've created the idea of story of place, which is much more complex. People hear the terms, they say, I can do that. Well, you can't. What they do is profound, and it actually transforms a community. So I would suggest you go look up their website, regenesisgroup.com. Go look at the case stories. They're not studies, they're case stories, which show you much about how it happened. And these are in places, mostly in North America, including a bit in Mexico. But you can see how it's working here. So I certainly feel like that, especially if you're trying to do community work, that would be a good place to start. There's another group which are a part of our community, which is Terra Genesis. They're also working at a local level, but they're working particularly with agriculture and regenerative agriculture. And they've developed a set of processes which bring their own understanding out of permaculture, which Regenesis has also, but they bring it to the supply system and help people who want to reinvent that. And they're moving that increasingly into looking at the whole business. So I certainly would recommend those two as sources. I feel like that there are probably a lot of people in my podcasts which people might find interesting, but I don't know, depends on your kind of work. We in the summit work with 6 essential value-adding processes. Those 6 are fooding, which makes it a process, right, rather than a product. So how do you build food from earth to earth? Sheltering, same thing. How do you shelter everything, human beings and other life forms, from earth to earth? Then transacting, which are people who build platforms like podcasts, like insurance, like loans from banks. They all, how it is people are doing regenerative work with those kind of transacting platforms. The 5th value-adding process that's essential to life is adorning, which is, who do I belong to? What tribe am I in? How do I, and businesses that fall in that are everything from interior decorating to tattooing. Because the way we say what I'm a tribe, whose tribe I'm a part of, or where I feel I fit, is by how we adorn. But that can also become incredibly irresponsible if not well thought about. And so that's why we consider it one of the number 4 essential value-adding process. And by the way, you can do more than one of these. They kind of have to be built together. The 5th one is what we call recreating, which is how we regenerate ourselves as individuals, and everything from spas to documentaries to education events. So I have, and then the last one is communing, which is how we connect with something higher than ourselves. It is not all about us, in spite of me having an email that says that. So the summit is built around inviting people from those 6 processes, and so are my podcasts. So you can go listen to the podcast, and I think you would find people who you wanted to know more about. And in every case, like you, I give you their website and their email so you can follow up and connect. If you have any trouble getting to those podcasts, you can go to carolsanford.com and carolsanfordinstitute.com, where there are links, and they tell you exactly who the people are. So that'd be my best way of saying, how else can you get other resources?
Wonderful. I really appreciate that. And I'll make sure to link to those resources as well in the podcast. One last thread maybe to explore on this conversation is the forthcoming book. I think knowing a little bit about the people who listen to our podcast and respond and communicate with us about Next Economy Now, this approach to doing business without hierarchies and some of the lessons you've learned over time, what works, what doesn't, and the capacities that are necessary or the conditions that are required for an organization to approach that, and the capacities of the individuals. Maybe could you provide a little bit of foreshadowing with that? Maybe not naming the 3 capacities and conditions, but maybe 1 or 2, and just so that we have a taste for what's coming in that book. And maybe tell us a little bit about when the book is going to come out, and that would be exciting.
Yeah, the first thing I would say is do not remove hierarchies as your starting point. That is, first, you just haven't built the mind of people to understand the whole of the business. They should have never been there, and they may or may not ever go away. Many of the business, they never go away, but they change so much and what the roles are that they're irrelevant. So I would say just don't do that. And I say that it is the 5th in a set of 5 steps if you're going to get there, and then you'll know better what to do, make sense of it. So the 3 kind of conditions for whether you're developing human potential, I'll just tell you a couple of them really quickly and why they fit together. If the work design you're creating doesn't build internal locus of control, where everybody gets to take full accountability for their decisions, they have value for doing that, they have capability to do that, then you can't do anything with anything else. And actually, that's what makes democracy work too, so that's why I say they're tied. But that uncoupled, which is often what people do with work design, uncoupled from external considering. So most people do internal considering. I keep thinking, how will that affect me? They're going to change everything. And my biggest concern about what's happened in some companies is they've then laid off a bunch of people. They have put out into the world people who felt like they didn't fit, and I think that's criminal. And they ask them, so people would say, well, we asked them. Well, that is, you're bad, as my grandson would say, because you don't understand that every human being is seeking to find their way, but it's going to be frightening to everybody at the beginning. So that's why I've created a set of phases of how to do this, because I literally did get rid of hierarchies. One of the first organizations that I learned so much. I even called it holacracy. My God, I love the founder of that term. What's his name? Arthur Kessler. So that's a couple of things under the criteria, but the things that are missing usually are the organizational conditions, because you can't, as individuals, just go do things. You can't even just organize a new set of practices. You actually have to build developmental systems into the business. And one of the first things I do is create the kind of things that invite people to take initiative. And I have a whole set of processes that is way too complicated to explain right here, but I created in a flow in the book that is called the initiative taking process. And it's how it is you structure people being able to see what's going on in the bigger world. I'll tell you one quick story. Colgate-Palmolive. I did this in both Europe and South Africa with them, where you formulate an infrastructure that people can see who their real markets are. So in Colgate-Palmolive, we had some teams, I called them market field teams, one of whom worked with big box stores like Carrefour, Walmart eventually, and others worked with small mom and pops, and they became responsible for the success of those folks way beyond just selling their products. Those kind of things invited people to take initiative. They found what they needed to do. Nothing was assigned. Nothing came from the top down. And so built the internal locus of control and the external considering, but you had to have a framework for that to happen. There is also, you have to have what I call promises beyond ableness, not promises without ableness. You build the ableness to take on massive challenges in support of the customer transforming their life. Also, it has to include, as my first book said, it's got to include all the stakeholders, but it has to start with, if you're in business, actually transforming the life of the people who are buying from you. I don't know exactly when it'll be out. I'm switching publishers. I felt like that the mass publishing industry is decaying. So I have 2 wonderful people who are working with me, and we're shopping it now to 2 or 3. The book will be written very shortly. Then we start some editing and rewriting. The way this industry works, it'll probably be early summer, fall at the latest, that it'll be out. And it does have at the end of the book these 5 phases with a set of questions that you can ask, which help give people, I think, a better grounding for how you, there's one other fun thing in it. It has one chapter called 30 Toxic Practices. There are about 100 of them, but they come from old paradigms like the time of royalty and the hierarchy of the church. That's where we got hierarchies. None of that's new. We've had it since kings and queens ruled. Then there are 4 other paradigms that caused us to acquire, including what we think are really good things like participation, feedback, all of those. I say, please don't do those things. They're toxic to developing human potential. And so you'll find all those in the book, and you'll find ways to develop your own, and I'll give you examples and stories.
Love it. Looking forward to that. And I know listeners to this podcast will be as well. I'm so grateful for all the generosity that you've expressed in the time that you've taken to chat with us for Next Economy Now. Very excited to finally have the opportunity to connect with you, to learn more about your work, and to learn about ways in which we can all get involved to educate ourselves and transform our mindsets to develop our capacities. And I'm wondering if you might just recapitulate the websites that we can find. I'll note them all with the podcast, but if you could just share right now where we can find you.
There are 4 of them. CarolSanford.com is mostly about my books and podcasts. Carol Sanford Institute is the work I do with businesses, and there are many case stories over the years of those. Seed-communities.com is where I have the smaller change agent groups and the business development series. And then the last one for the summit, and the dates are up now. Everything is ready to go for the Regenerative Business Summit.com.
Excellent. So grateful and deeply appreciative for you, all the excellent work you've done for so many years, and for the time that you've taken today.
Kevin, I'm really grateful to be here. Thanks for asking.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our past episodes, visit www.lifteconomy.com. You can also subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Overcast, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Before we finish, I wanted to insert a quick request for support for a new LIFT project, the Force for Good Accelerator and Development Fund. It is the first crowd-funded accelerator and fund purpose-built to support and develop best for the world B Corps. Those are the B Corps that score in the top 10th percentile of all B Corps and set models for how the economy can provide for human needs while benefiting all life. The fund prioritizes women-owned and person-of-color-owned enterprises and also has a bias towards enterprises that embrace democracy in governance and ownership, as well as those enterprises that address climate change through their core operations. We've raised over $400,000 at the time of this recording and are very excited about the overwhelming support we've received from over 100 investors. To learn more, please visit www.wefunder.com/forceforgood. That is www.wefunder.com/force4good. You can also find out more information at www.lifteconomy.com. We are incredibly grateful for your support. And thanks for listening.